I decided to take my young daughter for a short little hike. I looked up online and found one that was made specifically for kids. It was my day off and seemed like a good way to kill some time. When we got there, to my surprise, there were no cars in the parking lot. I mean, I guess it was February and 45 degrees out, so it shouldn't be too shocking. Along the dirt path, the sun was setting through the tall fir trees, and my daughter, enjoying it all, really was beautiful. Halfway going up the trail, though, I noticed off the path 30 yards what looked like a makeshift encampment. There was a blue tarp set up on top of a fallen tree and branches sticking out of the ground. Underneath it is what appeared to be a man wrapped up in a sleeping bag. Where we were definitely was no campsite, and he was not camping. I wasn't expecting to see a homeless person up here, 20 miles away from the nearest town. My daughter and I continued the half-mile climb to the end of the trail. Now, unlike most trails, this one we had to go back down the way we came from to exit. Heading back to my car, all I was thinking was, I really hope this guy was still asleep and minding his own business. I had no cell service, and we were all alone up there, and I felt even more nervous having my kid with me. As we came up near the tent, I told my daughter to be quiet for a little bit, just in case she could possibly wake him up, but it was too late for that. I looked over to the hanging blue tarp and saw an empty sleeping bag underneath. I stopped walking and ran through a few possible scenarios in my head. Could he be hiding behind a tree to jump out and rob me? Or maybe he didn't even know that we were there and nothing bad was going to happen. Being cautious, I held my daughter in my arms the rest of the way to my car, while looking around us and listening for crunching leaves or breaking twigs. All the way down the path, there was no sign of him. I felt a sigh of relief once I could see my car, but that quickly went away. Through the trees 50 yards away, not only did I see my car, I saw the top of a man's head crouching down behind the passenger side. I immediately ducked down and felt a pit in my stomach. I couldn't call anyone. I had no weapons on me and had my daughter to protect. We both sat down on the path out of sight from him. I told my daughter that we were just taking a break, and if she was going to talk, she needed to whisper. 5 minutes pass, and I still haven't come up with a plan. If I was all alone, I would have confronted this guy already, but with my daughter, I couldn't take that risk. I continuously poked my head up to keep an eye on him, to see if maybe he leaves, or much worse, if I see him start walking up the trail. With only 30 minutes or so before sundown, we were blessed with the stroke of luck we needed. Another car pulls into the parking lot, and as they neared my car, I saw the man run in the other direction into the thick part of the forest. I then snatched my daughter up and ran down to my car. As I exhaled in relief, and a group of teenagers exited their vehicle, they asked me if I knew who that guy was that just ran off. After I told them what happened, they informed me that they saw him holding a foot-long knife in his hand. I knew I was in somewhat of a scary position before, but it could have been much worse than I ever imagined. I thanked them for just showing up when they did, and told them to go home and not go into those woods, and I will call the police once I get service. I made a report and gave a description the best I could, but to this day, still no updates. During college, I made two really close friends, Tom and Drake. We did the usual things your typical college students would do on the weekends, usually bar hop. But for once, we all made a plan to do something different. I mentioned maybe we could go hiking. They both loved the idea, but they wanted to take it a step further and actually camp for the weekend. We knew of a place 30 miles away, but have never been there before. All three of us have never really been camping at all, though. But we were undeterred. You know when you think you're really going to get into a new hobby, so you buy all the gear you could possibly need, then suddenly lose interest and never use the equipment again? That was us. On that Friday afternoon, we arrived at the trail with our brand new backpacks and boots, along with sleeping bags and one tent that we would sleep in. We didn't have much of a plan. We just started walking and knew that we had to find a place to set up the tent before sundown. We must have walked 4 miles before we found a spot that we all agreed would be a good place to sleep. We started a small fire before going to bed and BSing about life, all without cell phones in our hands or alcohol to enhance the experience. And I think that's exactly what we were looking for. At around midnight, we went to bed because we had planned on hiking to a small lake that was roughly 5 miles away. Once I got into my sleeping bag, I immediately fell asleep, but I remember something strange happening. In the moment, and even the next day, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming it or it was real. I was sort of in a half-sleep state, but I heard the strangest yelling of what seemed to be a woman. A type of yell that seemed both far away and right next to me. It also didn't seem like a normal scream. It sounded like a supernatural type of noise. When I woke up the next morning, I was sure it was just a dream. So much so I never mentioned it to Tom or Drake. This is until later in the day, after we made our long trek to the lake. Tom mentioned something to Drake about hoping that he gets a better night's sleep than he did before. After I asked Tom why he couldn't sleep last night, my body froze. Tom described the same exact noise that I heard. Now knowing I wasn't dreaming terrified me and Tom for what was out there. Tom and I described more in detail what we heard, and the more we did, the more terrified we became. We even started talking about ending our hiking trip tonight, but Drake did his best to convince us that it was possibly a coyote or something, and that we needed to stay one more night. It was easy for him to say, since he didn't hear it. Nonetheless, Tom and I both agreed to stay one more night. After leaving the lake, we arrived back at our tent just before sundown. Drake opened the tent to lay down before Tom and I. Drake peeked inside with a puzzled look on his face and said, "That's weird." "What is it?" Tom said. "Did we roll up our backpacks before we left?" "What? No," I said. I walked over to look for myself, and all 3 sleeping bags rolled up perfectly and buckled as if we were ready to attach them to our packs. I was convinced this was somebody telling us to leave, because we didn't roll them ourselves. Drake said that it might be possible that we did roll them up ourselves and just don't remember. I told him that none of us even made our beds in years. What makes you think we just started last night? I said this was not an accident, and we should get out of here right now. Drake, and surprisingly Tom, was reluctant of that idea. They explained that we only brought 2 flashlights, and one of them already ran out of battery, and the second one's light was getting dim. After hearing that, and a little more convincing, I agreed it was better to try to sleep there for the night rather than walk 4 miles in the dark. I knew I wasn't going to get any sleep. I was just laying down until the sun came up. We all lay down in the tent and didn't talk to each other. We all stayed awake, listening. 2 hours in, we started to hear something. At first, it was quiet, and I asked, "Did you hear that?" We sat still, listening for it again. This time, it was loud enough for us to jump out of our sleeping bags and get the hell out of there. As we were scrambling to gather our things, I grabbed the one working flashlight. This screaming, echoing, ghostly sound seemed like it was coming from all around us. I scanned my light in every direction I heard it, but nothing was there. Once we got our shoes and backpacks on, we ran out of there as fast as we could, while leaving the tent behind. Once we were 50 yards away was when I was the most scared I've ever been. The sound of a cackling type laugh permeated all around us. Just like the first noise, there was no way to decipher where it was coming from. With the dim flashlight in my hand leading the way, we felt another sense of urgency to make it to the car before the batteries ran out. About halfway to the car, far away from our tent, and not hearing any strange noises, I stopped to make sure Tom and Drake were all right. They just shook their heads, and we kept going. The flashlight went out when we were 100 yards away from the car. Once we were safely on our way out of there, We discussed what happened, and all agreed that there was no human explanation for that. I never gave much thought to the supernatural before, but Tom, Drake, and I know a ghost or poltergeist or whatever you want to call it was out there. We just don't know why. When I was 19, my boyfriend Danny and I went on a short nearby hike. The trail ran alongside a quiet, windy road and a river. Driving there, we pulled off into a small turnaround spot that we believed to be the beginning of the hike. We climbed a short guardrail and saw a steep path that led down to the river. Once we reached the flat surface, we were now about 80 feet below the road. We decided to head upstream along the river in hopes to find what we were really looking for, a large, gorgeous waterfall. It didn't take long for us to hear the loud roar off into the distance. Once we arrived, it truly was stunning. We both slowly climbed down another embankment, down to the river. Every step down was a steep slope on wet, jagged rocks, not something for beginners. The water crashing down was so loud, we could barely hear each other talk, and the mist off the fall was blowing directly in our faces. We wanted to get even closer to the waterfall, so we began to navigate off to the side on top of huge boulders that were soaking wet and covered in moss. Halfway through, we both agreed it wasn't a good idea. One slip and fall could easily put us in the hospital. As I was turning around to go back, my boyfriend stopped me and pointed to something along the rock wall next to the waterfall. It looked like the opening of a cave. It looked surreal. I had never seen one before and wanted to check it out, but Danny directed me in the opposite direction. Once we safely made it back to the flat surface of the path and out of range of the roaring waterfall, Danny said that looked scary. There could be someone living in there. He also pointed out the articles of clothing that were discarded along the path. We didn't see any other hikers. The place seemed like the perfect place for a lunatic to live. I didn't have much to say to that. He probably was right. But there was something about it I really wanted to go back and check it out. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it and decided to go by myself the next morning and not tell Danny. I didn't plan on going deep inside the cave. I just wanted to look inside. So when morning came, I parked my car the same spot as before, and as I walked closer to the cave, I paid more attention to the old wet clothes that were scattered along the ground. I became even more scared to the likelihood that there might be people living down there. Once I saw the cave, I made my way along the riverbank on the huge slimy rocks. Once I made it past the waterfall, I took one more look at the 5-foot cave opening and slowly walked towards it. There was enough light shining through to illuminate the first 10 feet or so. I ducked down and started to make my way inside. The sound from the waterfall was slowly disappearing. Once I reached the point I couldn't see through the darkness anymore, I stopped. I didn't bring a flashlight with me because this was as far that I planned on going. As I stood there for a moment to take it all in, I heard what sounded like the movement of the rocks on the ground, and it wasn't from me. I stood completely still, listening for any more movement, but I heard something else. I heard throughout the cave's echoes a loud whispering voice saying, "I love you." I fell down as I turned around to get out of there. I slid down the embankment, past the waterfall down to the river. I bypassed the giant rocks that I climbed on before and ran as fast as I could in the edge of the river water. I was soaked past my knees. Once I made it back on land, still in a hurry, I slipped on a rock and banged my knee so hard I was left bleeding with a large bruise. But in the moment, I couldn't feel it. I kept going and finally reached the flat surface path. Once I did something I wish I hadn't. I stopped and looked back, and what I saw was a man standing just outside the cave, wearing tattered pants and t-shirt, long wet hair covering parts of his face, looking in my direction. He lifted one of his arms and motioned for me to come back. That was the point I screamed. and got back in my car as fast as I possibly could. I made it home safe, but was crying the whole way. After I got home and calmed down, I called Danny and told him everything, and realized I most likely escaped with my life.